Okay. Hello, everyone. We're just admitting everyone into the workshop. So just please bear with us as everyone comes in.
Sophie, are you wanting us to turn off our videos and mute ourselves so that we won't take as much bandwidth?
Yes, please just mute your microphone for now.
You don't care about the video?
I'm just going to be going over housekeeping in a moment, but I'm just admitting all the participants that are coming in.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for your patience, everyone. We just have a few people kind of coming in to the meeting, and so I'm just trying to get everyone admitted here. If for now you could just mute your microphones so that we don't end up getting any weird feedback, that would be great. Just so everyone here knows, we are live streaming on YouTube at the moment, and this recording will be publicly available. So just so you know that for your own personal reasons. And people are still just coming in, so I'm just admitting people as they come in. Okay, so it's 6:03. I think we'll just get started and then I'll just kind of admit people in the background as they come in. First of all, I just want to say hi to everyone and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Sophie Zinga and I do communications for the municipality. I'm going to be helping out with moderating our evacuation plan Q&A this evening. This is the first time I've done this, so please bear with me. It's we're all learning to use new technologies and learning as we go. So we'll try and figure this out as we go. Just a couple housekeeping items. Again, if you could please mute your microphones to begin. You can have your video on or off, your preference. We are live streaming on YouTube and this recording will be publicly available on the internet. We have an excellent group of panelists this evening, including Jennifer McGowan, our Emergency Program Coordinator, Jennifer Pierce, our Planner, Vita Krutine, researcher from the University of Washington, and Erin Hainan, Acting Fire Chief, and Adam Cayley of the local RCMP detachment. Starting off with our Emergency Program Coordinator, Jennifer, who's going to be talking a little bit about background, so how and why we developed the evacuation plan. Then our planner, Jennifer, the other Jennifer, will be going over some of the details of the plan, followed by Vita, who will be talking about evacuation modeling. Finally, we'll have a question and answer session with all of the panelists at the end. Any questions during the presentations, please feel free to type them in the chat box. If you want to ask a question using your mic and video, please hold off into the Q&A session. At that time, you can ask your question by raising your hand or by typing it into the chat box. I'll to keep track of the questions in order, but please bear with me as this is the first time I've tried this. So it's a little bit of a learning curve, but I'm sure we'll figure it all out together. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer McGowan, our Emergency Program Coordinator. And for title is not enough explanation, Jennifer is responsible for the overall coordination of Bowen Island's emergency program, which includes not only the municipality, but several volunteer organizations such as Emergency Support Services and the Emergency Response Program, also known as NERPS. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Sophie. So are you all able to see my screen right now? Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yeah. Thanks. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us this evening. As mentioned, before we jump into the nitty-gritty contents of the plan, I'm just going to take us through the objective for this evening, the history of the project, some of the methodology, and some of the methodology that was employed in development of the plan. So just to give you an idea of what the plan is, the comments from this session will be summarized in a report to council, and any issues raised that require incorporation into the plan will be addressed ahead of that presentation to council. The intent is to present the document in July for adoption. So if you've read it and found issues that we should be aware of, please provide that feedback as soon as possible. We're asking these additional eyes to ensure accuracy, confirm details. Let us know if there's something you think that's missing or you think should be included. We want the public to have confidence in this plan, so don't hesitate to let us know if you have feedback. If you don't have the capacity to read the 82-page document, that's okay. It's not necessary that residents read the plan. You'll get an overview tonight, and we'll direct you to relevant, more accessible resources that are also worth reading. I want to note that even when this plan is finally adopted by council, evacuation planning is not done. And we want to do a lot more with this moving forward. So while the hope is that the community will never need to use this plan, it's important that it doesn't collect dust on a shelf for the next 10 years. Additional training and exercising of the plan is likely to trigger future updates as we refine that planning, and we'll be seeking funding to enable further development of evacuation planning tools, such as more detailed mapping, land-based traffic modeling, additional training on and exercising of the plan, and other activities to further prepare residents and staff. So we write the plan. In addition to the obvious benefits of pre-planning for emergencies, evacuation planning specifically was recognized as a priority for Bowen as far back as 2007 in our Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which noted that further development of evacuation planning was required given the threat that wildland-urban interface fires pose to Bowen. Our 2008 Hazard Risk and Vulnerability Assessment also stresses the need for evacuation planning and notes that multiple terminating roads and the potential for evacuation by water present unique challenges. So council authorized staff to apply for evacuation route planning and emergency operations center grants in late 2018 and early 2019. And funding approval was received in early 2019. So how did we write it? Consultants were engaged to assist in the development of the plan, and multiple meetings took place with a variety of stakeholders throughout 2019, and those included Cormorant Marine, BC Ferries, Emergency Management BC, Royal Canadian Marine Search and Rescue, and others. During this time, I was also involved in something called the SIREN project, which is an acronym for Strategic Planning for Coastal Community Resilience to Marine Transportation Risk, which is quite a mouthful. So that research seeks to better understand how a catastrophic earthquake in BC could affect the marine transportation infrastructure and the coastal communities that rely on that infrastructure, and to identify effective resilience strategies. So after learning about the evacuation planning taking place on Bowen Island, the project organizers asked that we come and present Bowen Island as a case study to the SIREN project participants. So an overview of Bowen was presented, and a description of the evacuation plan project objectives and some of the challenges that Bowen may face. As a result of that presentation, the municipality was invited to collaborate with researchers at the University of Washington who wished to use Bowen Island as a case study to test a marine evacuation model that had been developed by Fieta Krutijn, who's a pre-doctoral research associate at the University of Washington. And over the last year, I've worked with Fieta to provide data on scenarios that might trigger an evacuation, and information on our locally available fleet of vessels that might assist. So the results of this work and that modeling have informed the plan, and he's been kind enough to attend this evening and provide additional information. So the first draft of the plan was produced in fall 2019, and staff training took place in November of that year to familiarize staff, municipal staff and stakeholders with the plan. We also held a tabletop evacuation exercise based on a wildland-urban interface fire scenario in February of 2020. And again, that involved Cormorant Marine, BC Ferries, North Shore Emergency Management, Metro Vancouver, First Bus Company, and others who participated. and lessons and learnings from that exercise have been incorporated into this version of the draft plan that you have tonight. So unfortunately, COVID-19 led to a delay in finalizing the plan, but thankfully in mid-April, the project completion was passed off to Jennifer Pierce, who was kind enough to step up and ensure that it was finalized ahead of the summer. So without further ado, I will pass you on to Jennifer Pierce, one of the planners for the municipality, who will take you through the plan contents.
Okay, thank you, Jen McGowan, for that introduction. Can everyone see my screen at this moment with this heading slide on it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is go through the plan as a document to just let you know what the contents are for the plan. And there will be an opportunity for discussion and feedback later in the session. I'm hoping that some of you have had the opportunity to go ahead and take a look at the plan. It is available online, and I've provided a link in the chat for those of you that would like to kind of follow along as I go through the contents. I will do so in order so you can scroll through and follow along with me if you would like to have more detail. And then we can also during discussion pull it up and talk in more detail, but I'll be focusing on the overview of the plan rather than its particular contents. So the intent of this evacuation plan is to provide a practical guide that's useful in conducting an evacuation. And it's focused on safety and well-being of residents and visitors to the island. And the intent of the users is that it would not only be useful for Bowen Island Municipal staff and our volunteers, our agencies and partners, but also for the public so that people can understand what the plan is and know that there has been some thought process going into how an evacuation would play out given different scenarios. So the contents of the plan start with the just a basic introduction, and then the steps that would be involved in the two primary types of evacuation and in declaring a state of local emergency. And then it transitions into guides that are divided based on the primary sections of an emergency operations center. And then at the end, there's an appendix with some forms. So I'll go through these various sections. So in the introduction, we find the definition for an EOC or Emergency Operations Center, and also the definition and differentiation between the tactical evacuation, which occurs more quickly in a very immediate need, and a strategic evacuation, which has more opportunity for a planned evacuation scenario. It also reviews how decisions are made based on the response goals determined by BCEMS, and these are the goals that are in a priority and are set by the province. It then goes through what to do at the very beginning of a scenario, providing the EOC organizational chart and how staff are organized within that chart in order to make decisions with a new structure that's designed to address emergency situations. It goes through a decision diagram that starts with the identification of a hazard, and you can follow the decision guide to determine when a state of local emergency might be declared or when a tactical evacuation is called for, all the way through to re-entry efforts. It describes the various EOC levels and when these EOC levels might come into play so that decision makers would know when to activate the various levels of EOC from 1 to 3. It covers tips and information for elected officials and leaders of the EOC from the principles of their leadership, the roles and responsibilities of the various people, and also the agencies that they work with, and then also where the legal authority to act resides in terms of the provincial acts. There is also information there on how in an emergency different expenses can be financed and tracked, and that's part of the finance section of the EOC as well. So then we get into the section that talks about the steps involved in the two different types of evacuation and in the declaration of a state of local emergency. In the first section, it discusses a tactical evacuation, which is one that occurs in a more immediate situation, generally right near where a hazard has occurred, and includes tasks for the incident command, which is the group of responders that are on site, as well as the EOC, which supports incident command. Then we go into the strategic evacuation and explain each of the stages involved in a strategic evacuation, including the alert stage, the declaration of the state of local emergency, an evacuation order, and a rescind order, including how one would decide whether it is the appropriate time to issue an evacuation or whether it's more prudent to wait given the conditions. There's also suggested evacuation zones, which are provided in a map. These zones are determined based on the amount of households in each section so that we can have a more or less even number of households in each zone. And the basic island-wide evacuation scenario is provided. So given baseline conditions, we would want to have a controlled zonal evacuation that would lead to a total evacuation of the island if that was what the situation warranted. It's based on a carpooling method to Snug Cove and then taking the ferry to Horseshoe Bay. There are many different scenarios that might call for different types of evacuations, but this is the baseline scenario, and then other alternatives are explored elsewhere in the document. It also provides considerations for different conditions. So how would we evacuate without vehicles, a more pedestrian-based evacuation? What to do with incoming visitors or workers who've come to the island for the day, how to set up reception centers and to deal with off-island reception centers, dealing with vulnerable populations, and also options around shelter-in-place approaches. It then goes through the various stages of an evacuation and what occurs at each stage and those considerations, including when a state of local emergency is required. So an evacuation alert can be called as stage 1, then a declaration of state of local emergency would be required in order to enter stage 2, the evacuation order. This requires an understanding of the emergency powers that come with a state of local emergency, and these are listed in the plan in that section. Then we get into sections that are organized by the Emergency Operations Center sections. This allows the Emergency Operations Center section leads and staff members to reference the plan in the section that makes sense for them so that they don't need to look at the entire document at once. So we start with the communications section, and these sections are all color coded to EOC color standards, and communications is the red color. So each section has the responsibilities of that section so that people understand their role. In the communications section, we also find a list of the contacts, liaisons, and procedures that are relevant to them. But most of the information for communications is found in the EOC Communications Toolkit, which is a separate document referenced in this document. The next section is intended for the operations section and also includes incident command information because these two groups work pretty intimately together. So it provides the responsibilities for this section and how the incident command is set up, the principles it follows, and standard procedures. It provides a description of the emergency support services, our volunteer team, how the operations would communicate and liaison with ESS, but more detail on that is provided in the ESS field guide. And then there are several operations teams that would be formed on the spot as needed, and each one performs its own role. So there's evacuation teams, traffic management teams, door-to-door notification teams, just depending on what's needed. And it goes through also the shelter-in-place scenario. It also provides information on those who would either refuse or be unable to evacuate in a scenario, including what to do with unaccompanied minors, people who have pets or livestock that they're concerned about, people who may not have the means to evacuate, and then those who might refuse to evacuate. And what are all the procedures for addressing these different conditions? It goes through the operations specific to what happens in Snug Cove, how we would coordinate with BC Ferries, how the BC Ferries operations differ during an evacuation scenario, and also how Snug Cove might be used in different ways in order to facilitate an ordered evacuation, which would involve the reuse of several spaces in the cove in a different way during an evacuation. So there's some preparation there. It also defines where potential assembly areas are that could be used in an evacuation and that would be indicated more specifically in a given scenario, and provides maps for each neighborhood, including how many households are in that neighborhood, where the primary and the alternate evacuation route would be in terms of a marine evacuation and assembly areas in each neighborhood. So each one of these maps are provided in a larger scale within the plan. In the planning section of the book, we have more of the data-driven information to help with planning the alternate scenarios. So we have general times for evacuating via the ferry, how population is assessed by neighborhood, by evacuation zone, and how those would be adjusted according to how many visitors are there, commuters, the high school students and school status, part-time residents, those kinds of factors. And then information about where critical facilities and infrastructure is located, including some alternate evacuation scenarios. Given that people may evacuate via personal watercraft, we may need to charter additional watercraft, and even what types of air evacuation is available. And then how to address recovery planning. So meaning at once an evacuation scenario is in a state of recovery and it's safe to bring evacuees back to the island, how those steps would happen. Finally, the last section is the logistics section, and it details again their responsibilities of the logistics EOC, how they would consider staffing and resources, and how they would support reception centers, including information on sanitation at the reception centers, how people would go through registration, group lodging concerns, and again, support for vulnerable people, and where reception centers that would be on island could potentially be located. At the very end, there's an appendix with some of the standard forms and how those would be submitted. And that concludes the general overview of the plan. I think next we go to Fita. I have some questions here, but I think that's more for the discussion, right, Jen? Okay.
Okay, thanks so much, Jennifer. Just for the new people that have joined the meeting, if you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box during the presentations. Otherwise, just reserve your questions for the Q&A session at the end. We are still admitting people as they come in, so there might just be a few new participants throughout the meeting, so we'll just be helping out with housekeeping. For now, next up we have Fita Krutine from the University of Washington. Fita has been using Bowen Island as a case study to test a marine evacuation model, as Jennifer McGowan explained. His collaboration with Jennifer has helped to inform the development of the evacuation plan. And a summary of his findings is included in the plan to help decision makers in the Emergency Operations Center. Welcome, Fita.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here, or I'm going to try to at least. Share. Is it possible to see something? Is it possible to see something? Because I can't.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah. I just wanted to quickly introduce myself and give an overview over what I've done. My name is Fita Krutine. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I work in the Supply Chain Transportation and Logistics Center of the university as a predoctoral research associate. So I'm on my way to a PhD degree in industrial engineering, and I bring in some expertise in logistic processes and routing, and also modeling of real-world transportation scenarios. And I found this, was involved in the Siren project very early, as Jennifer has already mentioned, and got introduced to this topic, and thought it was very interesting for a model that we were developing anyways. And that's how the relationship came into place. And I quickly wanted to give you an overview today on what I thought about what we considered and what we've done to get some results that were usable to inform the evacuation plan. So first of all, I wanted to introduce to the problem that we were considering. We were considering a hot summer day on Bowen Island, where a wildfire is caused by a campfire that got out of control. Strong winds cause a quick expansion of this fire, and some of the flames start threatening residential buildings. Roads are connecting different parts of the island are disrupted by the fire, and heavy smoke pollutes the air around the island. And that leads to multiple sub-communities being isolated from each other. And therefore the municipality decides to evacuate these isolated parts. This is pretty similar to the scenarios that Jennifer was just talking about. And so we thought about what was the goal. So we wanted to develop a planning tool which answers basically two questions. The first question is, how can we coordinate a marine vessel fleet to evacuate Bowen Island as quick and efficient as possible? This is particularly interesting when we think about that there are areas that might be cut off from Snug Cove and therefore cannot be served by the ferry. So you have to think about other ideas. And then the second question that it was supposed to answer is, how many vessels are necessary to be prepared for a variety of scenarios, since we don't know where the fire, if there is a fire, where this fire is going to happen and how it's directly going to affect the population. Then I wanted to talk about now, like, what is special from a modeling perspective about Bowen Island. The first thing that is important is that sub-communities are distributed around the shores of the island, and distances to another shore are mostly short. I know that is not necessarily the case for residents that are more in the central parts of the island, but they can still be considered as relatively short. Then that the population size fluctuates significantly in between the seasons is a very important aspect. And also that the island does not have an airport and no bridge to the mainland that can be used as a permanent connection that is usable by cars and vehicles. Then we only have one terminal on the island that consists of the capability to handle ferries. And some residents own private vessels docked to the island, and that might be useful for an evacuation. And that beaches and private docks around the island are usually accessible by small vessels in case of emergencies. I don't think that is really much of new information for any one of you, since you all live on this beautiful island. But I wanted to now look at like what an evacuation procedure looks like. And this is aligned with the evacuation plan. So upon an evacuation notification that is issued for a certain area, the population then travels to nearby docks, especially in these isolated areas that cannot access Snug Cove, and then waits at these docks for a vessel to arrive to pick them up. At the same time, this notification also triggers that vessels get staffed and depart storage. These vessels could be, for example, search and rescue vessels. These could be water taxis or other external resources that we might want to call in. And these vessels then travel to the evacuation location, dock at a certain location where there is a population. This population at least partially gets loaded onto this vessel, depending on how big the vessel is. The vessel departs, travels to a safe location. That could be, for example, Horseshoe Bay, or it could be Gibson's Harbor, or another location that is relatively close and convenient. And then the vessel docks, unloads, and departs again. So these people that were on this vessel are now arriving at a shelter so that they are in safety. And this vessel is now going back to the island. So it travels back to the island to pick up more people if there are any left. The only special case here that we have to consider is that in addition to that, some people might evacuate privately with their own private vessels. Then I wanted to quickly mention that this is the scope of the project that I looked at and that I worked on. So I basically only looked at the marine evacuation and routing part. The on-land part of this entire procedure is not part of the modeling that I considered, at least not for now. So what else needs to be considered? The first thing that is independent of any fire scenario is that the resource allocation plan needs to be pre-assessed so that the first responders have an idea what they are supposed to do. Then aircraft can often not be used when there is highly polluted air because of smoke pollution. This is sometimes difficult to operate aircraft in that area then. And furthermore, not every vessel that we could use is compatible with every dock. As I already said, the ferry, for example, is only available with the Snugco ferry terminal. And we might have other complications like that a hovercraft might be able to use a beach, but a water taxi might not always be able to do that. Then furthermore, vessels have also different capabilities in terms of speed, in terms of passenger capacity, and then we also have to consider a bunch of things that are scenario dependent. And that is, as I already mentioned, that the population fluctuates in between seasons, and it is therefore not entirely clear how many people need to be evacuated at each location. And that the location of the selected vessels fleet at the time of evacuation can be a little uncertain. For example, if we consider water taxis, they might not always be in the same location upon the time that the evacuation notification gets released. And then, as I already mentioned, some number of residents that use private vessels to evacuate is also uncertain because we don't really know how many people exactly that is going to be. So what did we need to decide to model this properly? The first thing, since this is a planning tool, that we had to think about from before anything happens, we need to think about which vessels do we need for a variety of scenarios, because we want to be prepared for different kinds of fire incidents or things that could happen that could trigger such an evacuation. And further answer the questions whether the vessels that are available around the island right now and permanently available are sufficient to do this. And we need this so that we can, upon evacuation, give an answer to like the following three questions. Basically, where do we need to send the vessels? How many people do we need to assign to each vessel? And how many trips do we need to do with each vessel, such that we evacuate the population from that specific area as quick and as efficient as possible. So how would this look like in reality? We've already seen this picture earlier in Jennifer's presentation. We would basically try to get people out of like docking points that we have around the island, like Kate's Bay, Snug Cove, Mount Gardner, Bowen Bay, and Tunstall Bay, and try to get them to safe land that is as close as possible. Now, what scenarios did we specifically look at? I first wanted to mention here that we created all these scenarios together from census data, used local surveys that were done over the last 2 years, and validated them with expertise of Bowen Island Fire Rescue, certain marine services, and the Bowen Island municipality. And this was also further informed by experiences from the Bowen Island tabletop exercise that was done to test the evacuation plan draft in February 2020. I attended that, and it was quite informative to see what can actually happen and what is a likely scenario. And we came up with 4 scenarios. The first scenario is a Mount Collins scenario. We assume a fire on Mount Collins that basically isolates the northern part or the northeastern part of the island, basically cutting off traffic from north of the Legion branch. And since we assumed summer day, a hot summer day, we assumed that there could be around 3,300 people in this red area. So some people would be able to go to Snug Cove, some others would have to get away from the fire up to Lakewood Point. That's why we can use these different docks that are in the area to evacuate the population. Scenario 2 is a relatively large scenario that would be the mid-island scenario, a fire that starts in the middle of the island. This would affect also on a summer day around 4,300 people if we consider a weekend. And there we could use the Tunstall Bay and the Bowen Bay landing sites. And for a third scenario, we considered Killarney Lake. And this would basically cut out the Mount Gardner area, which would affect around 300 people. Here we considered a weekday, so we didn't add like a large number of tourists that could be in this area. And there we could then only use the Mount Gardner dog. And lastly, we considered fire on Eagle Cliff Road or close to Eagle Cliff Road. That would affect around 700 people that reside north of the area where this road would be cut off, and this would restrict us to Hood Point and Kates Bay as landing sites. We have we ran our analysis then in the model, and we got some conclusions from this and draft some recommendations that directly informed the evacuation plan. And I structured this in two ways. I wanted to look at, or I'm going to present these results in two ways. For small evacuation scenarios where we have a population that is around about less than 1,000 people that is affected. So any scenario where the area that is cut off from Snug Cove Terminal is smaller than 1,000 people. An evacuation is actually possible within around 1.5 hours with all the vessels that are around the island. That includes water taxis, search and rescue vessels, and the ferry. And we can further derive from this that requesting additional vessels from other locations such as Vancouver or Richmond does not reduce evacuation time significantly, because it takes quite a while to get these vessels into the area. And by that time, we have already been able to evacuate the area and the population in that area. And the only way to further decrease this evacuation time would require additional vessels responding from within Southern Howe Sound. This could be done obviously on a spontaneous basis, trying to gather in additional vessels that are in the area by coincidence, or it would require positioning additional vessels there permanently. Then for larger scenarios, which then consequently accounts for populations of more than about 1,000 people, evacuation time is very sensitive to the size of the vessel fleet, because at that point in time, we need a lot of vessels to evacuate the island, or we need to have vessels making a lot of round trips to get these people out. And for scenarios affecting the eastern part of the island, where there is an access to the ferry terminal, requesting additional vessels, such as the Canadian Coast Guard, for example, will reduce the evacuation time significantly, around 10% when there is access to ferry, which reduces it from 2.75 hours to 2.5 hours. While that might be that much, because the ferry is a quite efficient tool for evacuation, on the western part of the island, where there is no access to the ferry, that was specifically relates to the mid-island scenario that I showed you earlier, requesting additional vessels, such as the Coast Guard, can have, this is actually a typo here, this is not 10%, this is around 30%. Decreasing the evacuation time from almost 8 hours to 5 hours. And if we further consider to bring people and evacuees to Keats Island and Paisley Island and bring them there temporarily, we can further reduce this evacuation time compared to bringing them to Gibsons by another 40%. So we would actually end up with an evacuation time of only 3 hours in this area. And the reason for that is that the distance in between Bowen Bay and Tunstall Bay and Keats Island and Paisley Island is just so much shorter that even small vessels that we have to use in this area can do many, many more round trips in a shorter amount of time and don't have to go all the way to Gibsons. This pretty much concludes the recommendations that I made based on the model that I ran, and we pretty much incorporated them in the evacuation plan that was presented earlier. That pretty much concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer your questions during the panel time that we have in a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Vita. That was great. Jennifer McGowan, I believe you had some additional comments before our Q&A session, or no? Oh.
Sorry, need to unmute myself. Yeah, I just wanted to, apologies, finish off by talking about the potential role for the residents who are taking the time to watch us here tonight and participate. So the plan itself is very much written for Emergency Operations Center staff and other stakeholders who are involved in conducting the evacuation. But there are things that you can do outside of this plan. The first thing I would recommend, and I've been saying this for years, is that everyone should sign up for the emergency notification system. This is how we intend on notifying residents when there is an emergency. We have 1,348 people enrolled as of today, which is roughly 40% of Bowen's population over 14 years of age. So still a long way to go to get coverage there. If you can help by signing other people up, if you've done it yourself, that would also be appreciated. House numbers are really important. It's key, not just in evacuation, but for any emergency where first responders are involved. This will help us and it will make things go faster. So if you don't have a house number, we would appreciate it if you could spend some time getting that installed. We have the emergency guide. There's a photo of the cover of this guide on the slide here, and that was produced specifically for residents. It's very readable and it's short. It was in the 2019 Gold Pages, the phone book. You might have seen it there. There are copies available online and at Municipal Hall once it's open again, and the library once it's open again. I would also suggest that you have a grab and go bag ready. There are lots of resources available on our website and the Provincial Prepared BC website that can help you do that. We also have local volunteers who are willing to help you get that set up. So don't hesitate to reach out if you need help. I would encourage everyone to get to know your neighbors and potentially start developing carpool plans, knowing that if there's an island-wide evacuation, we cannot all take our cars to the cove. Consider who around you might need assistance or be able to provide you with assistance. I'd also encourage you to get to know your NERP neighborhood coordinator, or volunteer to be one if you don't have one. The NERPs are the Neighborhood Emergency Response Program, and they've existed on Bowen for many, many years, but the program's recently had new life breathed into it through a passionate coordinator at the helm. So I'd encourage you to learn more again on our website and get involved if you're able. And then finally, Emergency Support Services is a provincial program that provides food, lodging, and clothing and other services to people who have been evacuated from their homes. And it's run entirely by local volunteers who could absolutely use your help. So there are lots of ways to get involved if this is something that you're concerned with, and lots of things you can do to help personally prepare yourself for an evacuation. That was all I wanted to finish with. The website where all these resources and others can be found is listed at the bottom of this slide. And I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Okay, so for any new participants who joined us after the introductions, I just wanted to give a quick reminder about our group of panelists. So that is Jennifer McGowan, Emergency Program Coordinator, Jennifer Ray, Planner, Fita Krutine, researcher from the University of Washington, Aaron Hainan, Acting Fire Chief, and Adam Cayley of the local RCMP detachment. So we're ready to go into our Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, I don't see any questions here in the chat, but if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your little virtual hand in there, and that will help me get the order of which your questions are asked in, and hopefully I can get that all settled in order. So does anyone have any questions about the presentations we've seen this evening? And just make sure to unmute yourself if you're going to, once I call on you. Okay. I don't see any hands up yet.
It looks like Adam has his hand up.
Oh, Adam. Oh, hi, Adam. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
It was a question for Fieta. In the modeling, is there any accounting for inclement weather?
Not right now.
Okay.
We just considered heavy winds In that sense, that spread the fire, but we didn't consider rain or sun, and we didn't really consider any effects on like the waves that could cause like differences for like boat speeds. Not right now.
Okay.
Crossing and loading times were assumed to be optimal. Great question.
Yeah, thank you.
I see a hand raised here. I have Brian McCabe. Were you still wanting to ask a question, or your hand is just?
Hi there, it's actually Julia McCaig on Brian's question. I just wanted some clarification on the slide where you showed the areas of evacuation. There were certain shaded areas, and the population numbers were somewhat confusing. There was the side of the island had 3,000 and another part had another number. They didn't add up to the total number of residents. Is that allowing for people that are moving from one area to the other? I couldn't quite figure out.
Can you just confirm, are you referring to FITA's presentation?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. This was like we try to be a little bit conservative in this aspect. So we assumed that we're gonna have both permanent residents and temporary residents in this area and a bunch of number of tourists. So we assumed a weekend day in the summer, and we added a large number of tourists to the area. So we actually used census data and on household data and like aggregated that number. So it accounts for, it gives a little bit of leeway to some movement of population around the island, but we thought we'd rather be a little bit more conservative than being too optimistic.
Okay.
Yeah, so also to clarify, we didn't create 4 different scenarios that fully covered each population, if that makes sense. So the total numbers won't be the total population of Bowen plus a few tourists, because some of the scenarios, for example, overlapped, where one was at the Legion and everyone north of that needed to be evacuated, and then another one was further down the road and everyone north of that needed to be evacuated. So yeah, the totals won't add up to the population.
Yeah, and I may have missed that. Sorry, I missed the first part of the presentation.
That's okay.
Thanks for the clarification.
Okay, thank you. Next we have Allison.
Thanks, Sophie. You're watching the hands that are up in the participants list. Like if you click on participants.
I'm watching hands and
Well, on the list of participants, there's little blue hands that go up. Wasn't sure if you'd noticed those. Anyhow, just as BC Ferries, there's no cars on the Queen of Capilano. You can get an awful lot of people on the car deck. Are we limited because there's only 450 life jackets? Is it possible to people had their own to take more?
Yeah, we're still limited by their license class. So no, unfortunately, my understanding is even BYO life jacket doesn't mean that we can put more people on the ferry.
Even in an emergency, when it's better to risk the ferry sinking than us burning up.
Yeah, so that decision is ultimately up to the captain of the ferry on that day to make.
Thanks.
thank you. So I do see a few hands up here, but I'm going to move to the chat box. So we have a question. Was evacuation for mobility challenged people considered in the model? It seems Snug Cove seems to be the only appropriate location.
In the modeling aspect, no, we didn't consider this. We wanted to do that at a later point in time. But yes, that is obviously something that we also raised in the evacuation plan, that mobility impaired populations need to be given special attention in that sense. But that is very difficult to include in such a model. And it's easier to do that on the spot when you have more certainty.
We have certainly had that discussion. We spoke at length about the difficulties in beaching vessels, even if the vessel is capable of beaching. Weather is a key factor, as well as the mobility of the individuals trying to board from the beach. So yeah, there are certainly scenarios that are more optimal than others, depending on the vulnerabilities of the individuals. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Peter Matthews.
Hi, sort of somewhat multifaceted question about what assumptions were made about the capacity of the vessels that were doing the evacuation. I'm thinking of things like, on the one hand, did you allow for pets? On the other hand, in accordance with the 72-hour rule, quote unquote, we have 2 very large bottles of water that we consider part of our grab and go kit. Were these sort of, what assumptions were made about these sort of factors in determining how many people could actually get on each of the vessels you considered?
Yeah, same as the ferry, the capacity is limited by their what they're allowed to carry. So that was what we incorporated into the model, and that information was received directly from the provider, whoever that was, whether it was Cormorant Marine or Royal Canadian Marine Search and Rescue. They gave us information on their fleet, including the length of the vessel, which helps us better understand vessels, which helps us better understand which docks they can dock to, the cruising speed, the approximate loading time, as well as the capacity or number of people that it could carry. I think it's obvious that if life safety is at risk and the choice is between humans and baggage, that the balls will unfortunately be left on Bowen Island. But as much as is possible, we'll try and have people evacuate with the items that they want to take with them. And certainly pets will make room. There's always room for pets.
Okay, I'll let our pets know that.
And thank you. So next up, we have Rob D.
Hello, it's Rob Gupty here. Hi, Jen. I believe you just answered my question about pets.
Great, sounds good. Thank you. Next up, we have Owen Plowman.
I have 2 questions, I think, and they're somewhat interrelated. When I see that you can get 1,000 people off the island in 2.5 hours, I don't understand what that means. Is that from the time that an evacuation is declared, or is that when people start to arrive at the dock and you can actually get them off? And I would also like to know what modeling has been done in case this happens in the middle of the night when there isn't a ferry and a crew.
We have considered in the modeling aspect, starting at the evacuation order. And that includes, since we mostly consider search and rescue vessels, search and rescue vessels have to be available within 30 minutes to be staffed. And we incorporated that in our modeling assumptions and how long it takes to staff them, to get the people in there and then get out on the water and get to the destination and board people.
I find it hard to believe that you could actually get 1,000 people even to the dock within 2.5 hours, let alone all at the dock, told about the evacuation, pack bags, show up, and then get mobilized and go.
Yes, I need to correct myself here. I'm sorry, I missed that part of the question in the first part. We are assuming in the modeling aspect that people are at the dock waiting, so that we don't have to wait for people to arrive at the dock.
So if you factor the time it takes people to arrive, how long do you think it will take?
I would need to model that. For that, we would need a land transportation model. That is model.
Sorry, Fita.
But you'd be surprised how fast people can move when there's smoke in the air.
It's also been identified as something that I would like to see done in phase 2, or the next part of this planning process, is do more work on the land-based modeling. We know that we're going to have traffic choke points and problems with parking, regardless of where we're evacuating to. So there's definitely more work that can be done on that. With regards to your question about modeling at night, no, we didn't do any specific modeling that took place at night, and we didn't model an evacuation that involved the ferry area that didn't involve the ferry. So again, a potential for future development. We did have those conversations with BC Ferries about the potential to mobilize the ferry of an evening. And certainly we would take the difficulties associated with that into account when we were experiencing the hazard. You know, these things don't usually happen you have some time to make decisions. And if we're expecting it to get worse over the course of an evening, we're certainly not going to we're going to ask BC Ferries not to let the crew of that ferry go home for the night, you know, potentially leaving us without it. So there are certainly things we can do to try and mitigate that risk.
Thank you. So next we have Edward Bachman. Oh, you're muted, Edward.
Thanks. Our neighborhood is closer to the water, closer to the beach than it is to our designated muster area, which is the Legion. It seems a bit counterintuitive to be moving away from the water, and especially in the event of a fire. Let's talk about that. What do you tell people in the neighborhood? Go to the, I mean, the rule is go to the Legion, but it seems like you should be going to the water.
Yeah, we wanted to designate a muster location for each of the evacuation zones that we laid out in the plan. The fact that your neighborhood has a muster location, whether it's right next door or 20 blocks away, it won't necessarily always be the place that you're going. We can't predetermine where the hazard is coming from, you know, what direction the wind is going that day, and so on and so forth. So it isn't always the case that you'll have to go to that muster location. You might be going to the muster location in a different zone, or there may not be an assembly advised in that. So again, the key learning is to, the key thing that I think people need to do is sign up for that notification system. And if you're aware of a hazard or an issue or the potential for an evacuation on Bowen, please listen to the direction of the authority. You'll be given specific information based on your address that tells you where to go. So don't assume that you know where that place is based on a predetermined muster location. Is that helpful?
Yes, very.
Thank you. So we have just a question in the chat before we move on. So is there some plan to evacuate an area of residents cut off by fire to a safer area of the island rather than off the island entirely?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, emergency support services has been planning for that for 20 odd years. So there are plans in place to support evacuees on the island. Again, it depends on the nature of the hazard and the potential for it to expand. We don't want to keep people here if there's the potential to evacuate or expand the evacuation area later. So it really depends on the scenario. But yeah, absolutely. If we can absorb people back into the community, then that's a potential.
Okay, next up we have Kate Coffey.
Hi, thanks. I'm wondering, and forgive me if it was covered off in either of the two presentations, but we have quite a number of people, apparently a third of the population go off island, either for school or work. At the end of the day, where do they end up going? I guess they get a notification on Bowens and then get directed to whatever location. And how would they get there if the location is Paisley Island? From if they're commuting from downtown in Vancouver.
Sorry, I think you cut out for me just a little bit there. So a bunch of people, we know a lot of our population travels off the island for school or work. You're asking what they do if they receive the evacuation notification while they're in the city?
Yeah, they assuming they are signed up, they'll receive the notification that there is a fire underway on Bowen Island. They're working or are at school, so you're evacuating the island to Paisley Island or Hut Island or wherever. But how do those people landing down in Horseshoe Bay, and then how do they get from Horseshoe Bay to where the evacuation spot is, or what do they do for the overnight?
Hey, if you're in Horseshoe Bay, you're already there. So we would work with our partners at other emergency management organizations. So the primary one that comes to mind is North Shore Emergency Management. And we've worked with them in the development of this plan. They have some capacity to accept our evacuees. So you would have information on where the reception center was that we needed you to attend. And ideally there would be transport available for individuals being dropped off in Horseshoe Bay that you could tap into once you got there. But again, the reception centers, while they've got multiple agreements and arrangements worked out, they're not pre-designated. So I can't tell you right now which one will be activated in that emergency, just that we have the capacity to receive evacuees at reception centers where they'll then be connected with information, food if they need it, lodging if they don't have insurance, etc.
Okay, thank you.
It's okay.
Next, Brian McKay.
Yes, just a quick question. There are in the BC Ferries fleet, there are more than just one boat, one ship that is capable of docking and on Bowen Island. Have those been factored in at any time, and has BC Ferries indicated that the delays would be too much or whatever? But there are a fair decent number, I think, and 5 or 6 other vessels that will dock, and if the loading and unloading is going very quickly, then they could just be waiting out in the Sound.
Yeah, great question, and a discussion that we did have with BC Ferries. Our understanding, or they led us to believe that none of those vessels that are compatible with our dock are close enough to get here within 12 hours. So not really good enough as far as evacuating the island goes. They wouldn't be here in time to offer that surge support. There are very rare exceptions when it might happen to be passing by for a refit, for example. So of course we'll always look to that potential, but it's not likely to be an option, is our understanding.
Cool.
Next we have Peter Matthews.
Okay, hi. Historically, one of the major problems with any sort of evacuation, whether it's an island or a sinking vessel, has been determining whether or not, in fact, you've got everybody out. How is that coped with under this plan?
Jennifer, do you want to field that, or?
Sure. So there are standard procedures that are followed during door-to-door notification of an evacuation, and those involve color coding the households after they've been checked. So houses would be checked in multiple sweeps with eventual color coding as having been cleared in an ideal situation. But it's always a challenge to know exactly how many people we start with on the island. And that's why we have projections of the possible population, but there's no way to know for sure that 100% of the people have been evacuated. But that's why we've followed kind of the general recommendation for how one conducts an evacuation in terms of door to door. And then there's also consideration for people who might be on trails or not in their home at that time. And so that's one reason why using the Bowens and being signed up for that can be so critical in an evacuation so that we can reach as many people as possible. The other factor that's very important is the NERPS program. Because they have people within the neighborhood that know personally the people that live there, and each NERPS volunteer is assigned to a limited number of households. They would be more knowledgeable about the current situation of whether people are currently on vacation or in the home, and can help us as a key contact to make sure that we're reaching people and letting them know about the evacuation so that they can evacuate safely.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a pretty full answer. Just one tangential aspect though. Would it be helpful, has it been considered to work with BC Ferries to find out how many people they brought on and how many people they've taken off on the given day?
So I can clarify that in the plan on, which page is it? It's in the planning section. We do have, yeah, page 57. I can actually share my screen briefly here. There is data on the averages of number of people in terms of the average flow, net positive or negative, depending on an average day. So if we take this one here, we're looking at a work day during the school year, and we know that there's a net negative flow of about not quite 350 people on the 7 a.m. ferry. So that allows us to adjust our model on any given day to reflect average ferry flows. But I think you were asking more specifically about flow on a given day and minute by minute decisions.
Kind of,
would
yes.
need to be coordinated on the day, but we do have these average models that can help us determine a bit more precisely and how many people to expect to have off of the ferry.
Yeah, I think the averages are very good for forward planning, but at a given day, I mean, BC Ferries, of course, go to great trouble to try and count how many people go on the vessel and the same number come off and so on. So they should have very accurate, up-to-date data in terms of the traffic flow over a day. Now, that isn't the whole story, but I would have thought it was an important part of the story.
There's also quite a bit of seasonal variation on the island. So any given day data would give us more accurate numbers at that moment for that day, but because of other larger fluctuations throughout the season, that preciseness isn't as helpful as it might be if we also had similar precise numbers for the current people on the island.
Yeah, without a base knowledge of how many people are on Bowen at any given time, the information on how many people have been added that day isn't necessarily useful, although I am taking your point, maybe it would be helpful to know how many, for instance, non-experienced card users had come over that day to get a sense of potentially the level of tourism. It's not going to give us the specificity that I would like in terms of being able to count every single head.
No, I fully accept that. I just thought it might be a useful sort of bonus tool sort of thing to add to everything else you're doing. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll just say that BC Ferries has been very cooperative, and I don't doubt that they would do everything in their power to facilitate an effective evacuation were one to take place.
Thank you.
Sorry, I had my space bar on the wrong. We have a question from YouTube watcher, or maybe it's just a comment, but I'll leave it to our panelists to decide whether they want to comment on this. So Marie is saying at Eagle Cliff, we've always said we'd go down to the beach. Didn't know there was a year-round dock in Hood Point.
Great, there is. That's what I'm told. Certainly, the situation is going to dictate where you should go. It's not always the case that people from Eagle Cliff will be able to get to Kate's dock, and maybe it's not always the case that that's the most logical place to evacuate from. So we've identified some of the main key evacuation locations, but we absolutely recognize that there are lots of docks, private docks scattered all across the island. So, yeah.
Thank you, Alison. I see you had your hand up, but I don't see it up anymore. Have you changed your mind? Yeah.
Just as a comment, if I may, on what Jan just said, I'd caution very heavily, and I think you've already recognized this about relying on private docks. Their state of repair is often not to be trusted, and secondly, the state of the water around in terms of weed that can stop a prop vessel or even a jet boat vessel dead in its tracks is not to be trusted. So I think you'd be very wise not to account for those in your planning. If on a given day, of course, one happens to be available and known to be good, that's an immediate decision at the time, but not for planning, I would suggest.
I should just briefly recognize here that most of the docks we've identified are in fact private. We only have 2 municipal docks or government docks, Mount Gardner and Snug Cove. The rest that have been identified in the plan are already private docks that are run primarily by like stratas or corporations or groups of individuals, householder groups. So again, the disrepair issue may still be a concern, but we're hopeful that they're.
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking of the small individual home type ones. You're quite right to make the distinction. My apologies.
No worries. I want to recognize those groups for having that infrastructure. Thank you.
Allison, you had your hand up?
I remembered. I noticed you don't have Seymour Bay. You've got the golf course noted as a or a muster point, but you haven't noted Seymour Bay as an extra, and I would have thought that would have been an ideal beach for the hovercraft to come into.
I'm looking at Jennifer, but I can field this if you want.
I can do, and then you can add as needed, but essentially, while beaches can serve as a location for certain vessels, the majority of vessels can have a hard time loading safely on a beach. So that's why we've focused more on docks, but certainly beaches could serve as additional areas of evacuation depending on the situation. But generally speaking, the majority of vessels that can indeed serve as alternate vessels require some kind of a dock situation, and asking them to come to a beach presents a lot of other problems. So we tried to focus more on dock-based areas as alternate marine evacuation points.
So
Did
I
you
was
wanna add
thinking more of things like, you know, there's a few landing craft things around that, you know, have ramps and go down on the beach, and the hovercraft, I think, can come into anything that's relatively flat. Is the Coast Guard willing to provide the hovercraft in that kind of a situation?
So we do have a couple of hovercraft, and there's additional data on the specific vessels. Let me share screen again. Okay, so there's particular information on the vessels, and then also for the different locations, which vessels can pull up. So if you can see here, there are certain locations where hovercraft can also come, but others where the hovercraft would not be able to land. So that was part of the consideration, but also if we look down at the capacity of the various vessels, by far the hovercraft is a lower capacity than the others.
And
it's not quite indicated there, but it's behind the data.
No organization, I'd say, I guess with the exception of Cormorant Marine, who have been very generous in saying that whatever they're doing can't be more important than evacuating Bowen, and they'll be sure to get their boats back as soon as possible. So thank you, Brian Biddlecombe, for that. But no organization has promised anything, so we can certainly make that request of the Canadian Coast Guard for the hovercraft, and my understanding is that if the situation demands it, they'll scramble their crews and send vessels to us, but there's no guarantee that those vessels are available at the time we need to evacuate.
Okay. So I guess my question on, you know, including Seymour Bay as perhaps a more easily reached and sheltered area for boats than Alder Cove is.
So
being Alder Cove's on the south side of the island and Seymour Bay is more in the sound, and you know, you could even use small boats for ferrying out to the bigger one.
Yeah, that is a good point. And it's also close to the golf course assembly area. But one other factor that we also took into account when identifying these kind of base dock pickup areas, which can be adjusted according to the situation, is to try to not have too many locations on the map so that people would be clustered, and it makes it easier for us to send watercraft to one or two docks rather than having 30 or so lots of little spots for pickups. So we did try to cluster those pickups in as few of a location and still be able to have people evacuate towards safety and not require that they go towards the you know, a riskier location if roads are being threatened or are in a hazardous location. So that's another factor that we were taking into account as well.
I do take your point, Allison. I can see the value in having a list of, you know, good beaches from a marine vessel beaching perspective. So I think that wouldn't hurt to include places like Seymour Bay that are well sheltered and available for that purpose. So I think it's easily added.
Okay, we have a question from the chat. And that is, would there be any shelter, food, water, etc., made available on any of the smaller islands if people were to be off there for an undetermined period of time?
Yeah, the goal would certainly not be to leave you there for an undetermined period of time. No, on Paisley and Keats, there are no arrangements in place to provide people with food and shelter. So we would be relying on the good nature of the residents that were available and asking you to just wait until we could send additional vessels once the people whose life safety was at risk had been moved to a safer area. But no, again, maybe an area for further development.
Okay, next we have a question from Judy. Judy, are you still with us? Okay, well then moving on, we'll go to Edward once again.
Concerning the private docks, will there be trained personnel present at the private docks to manage the safe and orderly movement of people from the land onto whatever vessels are there?
Yeah, that would be ideal. That'd be the goal. Ideally as well, the vessel would come, even the smaller ones, with crew to assist people in safely loading on if those providers have that crew available. So yes, that is the goal.
Okay. Thank you.
Just as, again, a comment on that, if I may, and particularly with regard to the topic of landing on beaches. With the exception probably of the hovercraft, all the other sort of vessels and landing vessels, the other sort of vessels we're talking about, water taxis and RCM style vessels, boarding those from a beach is for the athletic, not for a good chunk of the population of this island. So I think we'd be, again, wise to regard beaches as ancillary add-on extras on an as available and needed basis rather than a base one, as has been discussed.
Yeah, and we do note that in the plan for decision makers that there are challenges associated with loading people onto any vessel from the beach. So yeah, those are noted and we're aware. But excellent point.
Thank you. So I see there's a question in the chat here from Judy. Assuming this is phase 1, timeline, presentation to council in July, and then what?
What's the timeline? Presentation to council in July, and then what? I'm eagerly awaiting UBCM's next funding announcement. So they've put off applications or deferred applications to the evacuation route planning funding stream due to COVID. So my hope is that that's swiftly reopened and I can take advantage of that in order to further some of the development. In the absence of that, we'll continue to develop the plan regularly, develop the planning process, sorry, constantly.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up. Did anyone else have any questions? Just feel free to put your hand up or type it into the chat. Going once. Going twice. Okay, if there are no further questions, then I think we're about ready to wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and thanks for bearing with us as I struggle through my first Zoom workshop or Q&A or town hall or what you want to call this. So thanks for joining us again. This will be posted on our YouTube channel. If you know of any friends or neighbors who may be interested in watching the presentation and hearing the questions and answers, as well. The evacuation plan is on our website at bowenislandmunicipality.ca/emergency-program, or you can search it. I see Jennifer Ray has just posted that in the chat here if you want to copy and paste that. So if there's nothing else, then we're done for the evening.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.